Hello once again, everyone, and Happy New Year. So, I'm in between series right now that the Christmas holidays wrapped up and we haven't quite gotten into the January, New Year, New You sort of rush. And so I'm in between series at the moment. So this is going to be a special request by Peter Jaimez. Thank you very much for commenting. Which is, hey, I've shown the Prime Parry in various different ways. How do you attack out of it? So we're going to kind of bounce around as we discuss this because different systems use this parry for different things, and some will emphasize it more or less. And furthermore, within modern use, there is also the more or less, depending upon who you're fighting, since we kind of live in an amalgamation of a lot of different time periods of fencing advice. So, firstly, what am I talking about? If you haven't seen the video where I talk about prime parries, to basically sum it up, it is this. It is some form of either here or here. Technically, that can be directed around as well, and defends against any possible cut or thrust, because I can direct this anywhere pretty much with very little movement of my hand. Now, for attacking out of it, there's of course some caveats to be aware of. Number one, what kind of sword are you holding should really inform whether or not you should attack out of this. Reason being is that I'm currently using the simplest sword I can be holding, just my arming sword. You could be taking this with a backsword, you could be taking this with a saber, you could be taking this with a side sword, you could be taking this with a rapier, you could be taking this technically with a long sword. It could be any number of weapons, and each one will slightly influence the results you can get. So let's start off first with attacking into the prime parry. So what I mean by this is, and this especially is true for using things like long swords or if you're fighting out of the draw, there's the idea of turning this from just I am standing in the parry, but instead moving into the parry. So for example, this is commonly shown off the draw, or if you look at Fiore's single-handed sword system, the idea is an attack is coming in, I'm going to move up into this cover, sometimes with an offline step to get this zone, other times with a smaller, more forward step to get a bit more of an angle. And then from there I have a couple different options. The simplest option is going to be turn over and come back down. So I would defend, turn back over if I get enough of a pop, or alternatively, and so what that would look like is sword is coming down through my head, defend, make a wedge, down with a cut. Alternatively, if I'm stepping out a bit more and looking for more of a cover, defend, and then from here I can move into grapples or what have you, but the simplest thing to do is just turn over once again. Same motion, both times. And that's generally what you're going to be seeing if you're moving into a prime parry, is that idea of make a cover, and either I made enough of a wedge that I can then come back down, which also includes the possibility of thrust, but usually it's going to be coming back down, or I made enough of a cover here that I can then work to the other side. So, with that caveat out of the way, let's not talk about attacking it by itself. Now, for the most part, this is something I only recommend you do at pretty good distance, as we are talking about the parry, not necessarily about just high positions. So difference here. If I am using something like my basket hilt or something else that has a more intense hand guard, I can stand and fight from here, and in fact we see this. But if I'm using something like an arming sword or a messer or what have you, or even a side sword, being here for too long is now dangerous because you can target my hand. Which is why we start to see it being more withdrawn, we see it, more withdrawn in earlier sources, and it's only later that we start getting really comfortable with holding our hands out there. Now, it's a relatively small target, and it's easily defended as we've shown, but, if we're talking life or death, you don't want to be risking that too much. And furthermore, the time spent learning to defend just your hand because you're fighting out of here would be better spent learning to fight out of better positions. Anyway though, so bear in mind, we are not talking about attacking out of Shia or anything along those lines. We are talking about out of the parry itself, right? Which, again, we talk about moving in the parry. Now we find ourselves in the parry, and we can then attack from there, which is kind of a guard of its own. It's basically Hangenort, hanging guard, what have you. There's a lot of different things that cover this idea. It's just one of the options. So, firstly, we have two different lines that we can work under. And for this, I'm just going to go ahead and use the standard numeric system to be as simple as possible. So to divide that, even numbers will come from my right, odd numbers will come from my left. So, the simplest way is going to be to attack with even numbers. These are all backhanded cuts. What this ensures is that I only have to move my tip when I launch those attacks. So if I'm here, regardless of which version I'm in, right? If I'm going to launch a number 2, that's a 45 down from my left side. All I need to do to launch that cut is just lift my tip, and I can execute that cut. I can either execute it from my shoulder and my core, or I could execute it more from my wrist, but I'll need to lunge. Pretty straightforward, very simple attack. One a lot of people don't think about. Alternatively, the fastest attack that I can launch would be to do a number 4 cut. So number 4 ascends from my left side. So that would be I just squeeze my fingers and open my side, and that's going to allow you to perform a relatively small cut. Now you can make it more dramatic by opening your shoulder a little bit more, but it's always going to be, while fastest, relatively weak. More often than not, this one is more like a cut that opens and then turns into a thrust, but I'll not go there yet because I want to talk about the thrust mechanics before we cover that idea. Lastly would be executing a 6 cut. A 6 cut is horizontal from my left side, and that's just, again, just like the 2 cut, but instead I turn to just flat and across. More often than not, that's not something you're going to be throwing against someone's head, that's something you're going to be throwing against their body. The idea being there that rather than lifting the tip, I'm dropping the hand and then executing a technique, or lowering the whole shape, then lifting the tip. All of these are quick and fast, and they work very well against your opposite numbers. So if someone else is standing in the prime parry, so if you are holding a sword at home, 1, be careful of the ceiling, and 2, match up with me. Your 2, that targets my arm, especially if I'm here, that's a very good place for you to go. Your 4 goes up into my body, or can come up under here into the face. We'll talk about that again in a second. And your 6 can target my ribs all the way down to my leg. Can also target the arm, but you'd be better off doing it too. So all those are pretty straightforward. Again, very fast to do because they're all backhanded cuts. If you want to do a cut from your right, so that's all of the odd numbers, you have to turn your hand over. That's what makes them slower, but if you're moving through the guard, especially if you just receive force, they become slightly easier because they cover you as you go. So a number 1 cut. The idea here would be that I let my tip turn over, and then I just bring it down along the line that it was already holding. Now a key thing when you do this is don't make it happen from your arm. That doesn't do you any good because now it's bringing the guard back, unless you are protecting yourself as you enter. That's different. That's me moving up to my arm, not me bringing my arm back. Second thing, this can happen in front of you. Don't worry about trying to keep it super tight to you. Let it be open cut. What I personally like to do is when I do this, the tip will go past my left ear so that my hand stays in relatively the same place. This is often done with movement, very straightforward. You're targeting the head and the face with it. When it comes to attacking from below on this side, again, you can execute a number 3 cut that ascends from your right. However, there's 2 different ways of doing it. If you want to just execute a 3 cut from here, and this is especially true for people using long swords or things along those lines, then you can bring your hand through and then back up. This is a relatively more of a shoulder cut. It's especially good if you found yourself standing in the prime parade, left foot forward, as now you can then step with it. However, it's a very big cut. Alternatively, the other way you can do it is to use my hand as a pivot point. So I'm here, I'm going to keep my hand relatively where it is, pulling with my hand and relaxing, and then pushing it forward. So again, I just make a very quick little turnover and cut mostly from my wrist. Do you need to do this one a lot? It's probably the weakest of all the cuts, well, barring what I'm about to discuss. It's probably the weakest, but it can be very, very deceptive, especially if someone is pre-guarding their head. So for example, I take the prime parade in response to a cut to my head. They are anticipating that I will throw a number 1, so they start raising. Instead, I throw a 3 that goes underneath their guard against their arms. Whenever you cut from below, remember the golden rule, step offline, guard your head. So same thing here. I guard, I start to cut, or I get ready to cut, they're pre-guarding, and I'm immediately back in the same guard. Very fast. Final option is to execute the number 5, probably the weakest cut out of them all, because it sucks. 5s suck, they really do. So a 5 cut would be horizontal from my right, and the idea there would be, once again, I turn my hand over, and then I bring it back across. Now it's not to say 5s aren't useful. You may find yourself in a situation where you need to use them. However, the thing to be aware of is that 5 and 6 have no leverage, right? Anyone can overbind this from below or above because it's flat. In particular with the 6, it's usually pretty easy for you to flow back into something because it's a backhand cut. For the 5, it's natural and it's long reaching, but it's weak. So that's why I kind of define it as the weakest of these cuts. Not because it's literally the weakest, that'd be the number 4, but because it gives you very little advantage. But once again, same idea, I just turn my hand over, come back through. Really the best thing to do with that is if you are following some of the Dusak discipline, then oftentimes you will enter and then make a middle cut before you make your next cut to keep the opponent at bay or to bring their guard low. Same idea, be comfortable with your 5s and your 6s. Now, those are kind of the basics in which we can launch again. basically all of our cuts, you also can execute the number 7, and in theory, the number 8. So let's talk about those. So 7, that's straight down the line, 12 to 6. All I do for this is I just turn my hand over like I'm doing a 1, but I just bring it straight down the line. Very simple to do, very fast to do. I recommend making it a half cut rather than a full cut most always, as the whole benefit of being up here is I can just pop the head nice and easily. I really like doing the 7 out of the hanging guard, hence why they're usually linked together, because this guard's the 7. So you launch the 7 from it. Very simple. Now the 8 cut, that's a tricky one. So I've got a whole video up on the 8 cut, what does it do? But basically it's this straight up line. There are 2 ways you can do it. You can do it with the short edge, which is the more common way, or the long edge, which is the less common way. I also discussed in that video the idea of you can launch the 8 cut by not doing an 8 cut, but by taking an angle of an 8 cut. So bear with me here. Use the line that my foot is currently staying on. I'll even back up to make 100% sure I'm there. So this is our line between us. Right now, to execute the 8 cut, that would mean I have to move my tip to the very middle, then straight up. That's an 8. Alternatively, however, if I step offline and then execute what is to me on number 4, that still goes through the 8 line, thus striking. So that's kind of the way you could execute it. Now, does it get you any benefit? No, not really. The only time I could see this happening is if someone tries to overbind you and you're more doing a draw cut at that point, but it's not really necessarily all that useful. I guess I could also see it if you were, but that's more of just a transition than anything else, so I'm just gonna, we talked about it, but it's doing, okay. So, all 8 cuts, all possible 8 angles of attacking, pretty good. Now, let's talk about thrusts. There are a couple different thrusts that we can do. There are thrusts that resemble, for example, plunging thrusts, or the imbrocata, which is where we are going to come down from above, and then we can either stay here or we can turn over. Or there are also thrusts wherein we're going to turn up as we go, which is more like the idea of winding over. So, first, the most basic. You keep your hand exactly where it is. There are 2 lines on which you can thrust, here and here. Now, for just going straight above, all I need to do is if I want to thrust from my dominant side, I just do a small disengage as I pull my arm back, which gives me power and gives me angle, because I'm going over a blade if I'm doing this against another hanging guard, and I push. That's the simple thrust. Alternatively, if I'm going through this opening, it then resembles the 4. So remember I talked about the 4 could be more like a thrust. We're going to reinforce what we have as we thrust forward. So here's that from the side. So over, so dominant side thrust, up, boom, under, boom. I'm more just reinforcing as I go. And that's if my hand stays exactly where it is. Alternative is that I turn my hand down on either of those respective openings. So if I'm going over your blade, that means I'm coming from my right down. I can either go just nails up, a la quart or quarta, depending upon which tradition you follow, or I can go down into more like, the Italian has escaped me, that's why I have a resident Italian, or I could go more into flute. We'll use German terms. Basically the idea is that I'm supposed to lock a gate. I think this is one of the iron gates actually. Anyway, point being, I do my turnover and I thrust, and then as I'm thrusting I can either turn down to wedge out of the way, and that's particularly nice if you're gaining ground as you do so. Or alternatively, if I need to gain more range, I turn my hand up, which now allows me to lunge with safety. So here's those again. I go over, down, or I go over, out. Pretty straightforward. Same thing other side. This time you don't really want to plunge downward so much, because if you're here and you're just reinforcing, you can actually still plunge down, but you're plunging more into the opening. This is working under the assumption that when they push, they're going to push less this way like they should, and more like this, on top of your sword, which, if you're going around a buckler, they may do that. Doing around a sword, not as common, but they do still do it. The idea there being, when I extend and I feel that resistance, I just push around, allowing my thrust to still land as it was. So I'll show that again. I'm pushing forward and I drop, allowing me to reach around a la duplier end or things along those lines, really just winding around. Second option is I now just go basically into secunda, where my nails are down. So I'm here, I go to reinforce, I turn down, and I do more of a lunge. The nice thing about that is if someone catches me, I can ping into a lot of things. I can cavazione / disengage. I have a lot of great options from there. I personally like it a lot more than the idea of trying to go into the reach around, but I also mostly use these when I'm fighting with my backsword, so that does affect how my hand can turn. Again, try all of these with whatever sword you're holding to feel how they feel, because what I'm going over right now is just, hey, here's how it feels. Or, rather, here's what I recommend, here's how it feels, but then there's going to be specifics as to what's a good idea. Now, the final thing we need to talk about is the idea of, we've got this, what happens when it changes lines? So, remember I talked about how I can defend against all 8 actions. You also can then attack from it in more of a parry riposte, which is kind of what I talked about when I talked about moving into it, but now we're going to, you were here, someone tried to attack around you, you defended that line, and then you go to hit. So, I'm in one of the Prime Parries. If anyone attacks with their dominant side action, so that's doing a 1, a 5, a 3, or a thrust over your blade, then your parry looks like this. Remember, where I just bring my hand across. Now from here, the simplest thing to do would be a 1, a 5, a 3, or your dominant side thrust. The only time you want to cut from your non-dominant side after you do this parry is if your hand has secured something, in which case it's always going to be a 2 or a 7. 2 is going to be easiest. If they are attacking from their non-dominant side, and they fire at your arm or your ribs or what have you, then that means your parry looks like this. It can be slightly up, slightly down. In which case your best actions, again, are to fall back with non-dominant side. So, let's say they throw a 2. I pull my arm slightly back, I could launch the thrust, or I could also turn over and launch a 2 of my own. I could turn over and launch a 6. I could raise into a 4 or a thrust. They go at my ribs, same idea. It's exactly the same opening on all 3 lines. Now, that may seem a little strange, especially when you first start practicing it, but an important thing to remember is that, especially with this parry, you're making a big line. If you're fighting a right-hander, that means go ahead and hold up the parry again. You've got all of this that's currently open. That's a big gap that you can fill that cut through, and what's my choice? I have to deal with it. So trying to come over this side doesn't really work so much. Not that you couldn't, but then you're freeing up their sword as just unnecessary. So it may feel a little strange at first, but that is the fastest route. Another benefit that this gets is that you can grapple and then add a thrust on the low or high line, usually the low line. You might have seen that if you've watched any of my bayonet footage. That one's quite nice. Not as commonly done, but very useful, especially if you can grab hold of their pommel. So, really, the only thing left is if they thrust at you, in which case your parries look exactly the same. Like I said, it's just those 2 sides. So, that kind of sums it up. So, just to reiterate, you can throw all of the attacks out of this parade, out of this guard. Not all of them are going to be exactly the same, and certainly you don't want to get obsessed with fighting from it, because it can parry everything and can attack with everything. That's great, but it's the jack of all trades, master of none. Even with a well-trained arm and a good posture, it is very taxing on your arm over time. You want it to be something that you can fight comfortably from, but not something that you are reliant purely upon. It's really more for short, momentary engagements at best. And if you become very comfortable with it, you can dupe people into going into this game from which you then execute your technique. But you shouldn't just, stand up here and then hope that they're going to play it, because while you can defend everything, you still have to do the active defending. Either way, though. Thank you all very, very much for watching. Happy New Year. We'll go over some other techniques another time.